This is the Golden Age of American Invention, Objective 2, about how not just the inventions, but also investment in those inventions expanded the American economy after the Civil War. Now, like we said before, guys like Vanderbilt, Rockefeller, and Carnegie, they were making their millions creating or expanding railroads, expanding oil production, expanding steel production. But when all these new inventions came about after the Civil War, all the way up to World War I, from about 1865 to 1914, the idea was everybody's going to want these things. We've got to mass produce them. We've got to get them to the people. And there were various people who made their millions not by creating things or expanding an industry, but simply investing in a lot of things that other people had already created and making millions that way. Now, it's kind of ironic when you think about it, because prior to the Civil War, millionaires were a very rare handful in society. In fact, the term millionaire doesn't even come into existence until 1840, 20 years before the beginning of the Civil War. Now, it seems, again, kind of odd, because there were some people who were wealthy, but to have the American language not even include the word millionaire gives you a rough idea of how rare that type of thing basically was. The post-Civil War time period would see a dramatic change in that, as millionaires would start popping up all over the place. Now, like we mentioned in prior lessons, there were people like Carnegie, Vanderbilt, Rockefeller, people like that, who had made their millions a certain way. But then there was a guy who was just as important as them, made just as much money as they did, by doing something totally different. He didn't build one business or expand one business. Instead, he was the guy who financed or found ways to finance many of the businesses that already existed and finance a lot of the new inventions that already existed and become a millionaire in that particular fashion. His name was John Pierpont Morgan. He was known as J.P. Morgan. His nickname was Big John with the Purple Nose. He had a skin condition that always made his nose kind of like a purplish hue, which you wouldn't be able to see in this picture because it's black and white. But there are very rare photographs of J.P. Morgan because he didn't like to be photographed because of his nose, basically. Now, Morgan was raised in wealth to begin with. This is a picture of his father here, and as you can see, he's college-level reading in American business courses. His name was Junius Morgan, and Junius had made a career in the banking industry himself, and eventually he taught it to his son, J.P. Morgan. Now, Junius Morgan had started the House of Morgan. He was the chief executive officer of it, which was, as you can see here in the writing, an American banking dynasty that led to the rise of modern finance. Junius Morgan was the president of that, and as a young man, J.P. was taught how to run the business. But also, J.P. was educated at the finest schools around the world, and because he had a wealthy father who could provide him with such a nice private education, J.P. becomes very cultured. In fact, he was one of the most famous art collectors, definitely in the United States at that time, and maybe even the world. His level to, or the amount of money he was willing to spend on art was sometimes mocked and ridiculed, but his house was full of various classic works of art, and even his own father, Junius, thought it was a waste of money, but J.P. considered himself to be very, very cultured as a person. But of course, that didn't soften him up when it came to business. J.P. was a banker who was better known for his talent in mobilizing investors, buying companies, and making them better. Again, he doesn't really invent anything in particular, but he is considered one of the major financial figures that builds the American industry during this time, if nothing else because he coordinated the finance to make all of these things happen. In fact, he was the chief financier of many of the inventions of the time, including Thomas Edison's light bulb. Now, when Morgan invested in Edison's light bulb, he basically thought that he was on to the next big thing. Demonstrations were done around the country to show off the Edison light bulb. Morgan even had his own house lit by electric light so that people could see what was so big and such a big deal about it. But also there were other people involved in the electrical industry as well, and this is going to make things kind of dicey for Morgan later on. This is a picture of George Westinghouse, who was the CEO of Westinghouse Electric Company. And if you remember from the prior objective, this is Nikola Tesla. Now, Westinghouse had invested in Nikola Tesla's alternating current, AC current, because he felt like that was a much safer and better way to go. Edison was practicing DC current or direct current. When Nikola Tesla got the contract to light up the Chicago World's Fair in the early 1890s, Westinghouse immediately felt like he had made a smart investment. Tesla had become an immediate success, and all of a sudden Westinghouse AC generators were popping up all over the country. Now, not to be outdone, J.P. Morgan and Thomas Edison launched basically a political campaign against Nikola Tesla's alternating current. In direct current, I know you're going to have a hard time reading this, so just to give you a rundown. In direct current, the flow of electricity is in one direction only, and this system operates at the same voltage level throughout and is not as efficient for high voltage. Direct current runs through various light-emitting diodes, that type of thing. Alternating current is an electric charge that periodically reverses direction and is transmitted to customers by a transformer that could handle much higher voltages. This is what is usually used in car motors, radio signals, and various appliances. Now, Tesla and Edison got to the point where they really disliked each other, and this was kind of ironic because actually Tesla worked for Edison at one time. So they did various things to discredit each other and the type of current that the other one was promoting. Tesla usually did these things verbally. Edison actually got a little nastier about it, creating the electric chair and only powering the electric chair with alternating current to see how dangerous it could be. Edison even had an elephant named Topsy executed by using alternating current to show how dangerous it could be. Now, this campaign was all about big business. Pierpont Morgan, J.P. Morgan, and Thomas Edison wanted people across the nation to use DC current and Edison's technology. And George Westinghouse and Nikola Tesla wanted everyone to use alternating current. In the end, it was about who could sell the most and make the most money and put the other one out of business. Well, eventually the war of the currents would be won by Nikola Tesla and George Westinghouse. The Niagara Falls contract in the late 1800s was specifically important. Niagara Falls was looking for a current to go along with the generators they were creating. Water power from Niagara Falls would drive the generators, and the generators were going to create electricity to be used throughout the region around Niagara Falls. The question was if they were going to use DC current of J.P. Morgan and Thomas Edison or the AC current of George Westinghouse and Nikola Tesla. In the end, they chose to use the AC current. Now, this was a major blow to J.P. Morgan, who had invested millions against his father's wishes, who thought it was crazy to do, but he had invested millions in Thomas Edison's direct current technology. And so what eventually happens here is that J.P. Morgan buys out George Westinghouse, and he gets a hold of Westinghouse Electric and also bought out the majority shares in Thomas Edison's electrical company that you see here, the Edison General Electric Company. At this point then, Morgan controls both AC and DC current in America because he owns all the property rights to Westinghouse and Tesla's alternating current, and he's also taking the name Edison off of Edison General Electric and just leaving it as General Electric Company. It's still known as General Electric today, and it's really one of the leading suppliers of alternating current and direct current in the country. Really kind of a brilliant move by J.P. Morgan, although it upset Thomas Edison, as you can probably imagine, who went to work one day to find that his name had been removed from his company that was now owned by J.P. Morgan. Now, Morgan, as you remember from a prior study as well, also branched out to other areas. He invested in a lot of inventions, organized the financing for a lot of inventions, but also organized the financing to take over existing businesses. If you remember, Andrew Carnegie had built Carnegie Steel into a major, major business in America by 1901. And it was in 1901 that J.P. Morgan bought Carnegie Steel and merged it with other steel companies he'd already had to form U.S. Steel, which in 1901 dollars was the first billion-dollar company in America. But J.P. Morgan's reach extended even beyond that. In the panic of 1893, there were a lot of people who were questioning what was going to happen with the country. Gold was low. The government was even running out of money to be able to help or do anything with. And you're not going to believe this, but J.P. Morgan is the one who organizes the financing to bail out the U.S. government. Now, that's never even really been heard of when our government, I mean, we've gone into debt to various countries and various people before, but it's never solely been on one person to organize the financing, not to bail out a failing business, but to bail out the U.S. government. Now, that alone should give you an idea of what kind of financial titan during the late 1800s and early 1900s that J.P. Morgan was. When Morgan eventually passed away, and you can see here the prominence of his business, this is J.P. Morgan and Company on Wall Street in New York City, right across from the New York Stock Exchange right here. When J.P. Morgan passed away, Wall Street closed for a week just to honor his memory. Today, Morgan's legacy lives on in a lot of different ways. This is actually given J.P. Morgan's finances, and you can see the name Morgan right here. This is the mausoleum where J.P. Morgan's remains are. It's actually kind of understated, given how much money he actually had. A number that I honestly don't have the total amount for or know at this time. But I can tell you that his legacy lived on through his company. This is the House of Morgan as it stands today, the earliest version of the House of Morgan, kind of a capital center of American finance. And J.P. Morgan Chase and Company has become a major banking and financing institution in America still today. Not only does J.P. Morgan still loom large over American finance and how things get done here, but even in places like, incredibly enough, China, J.P. Morgan is still a very respected name in not only American, but worldwide finance. Okay, that's all on American investment in J.P. Morgan after the Civil War. Thanks again for listening.